So welcome everyone. I'm Linda Bregan. I am the co-chair of Mayor Cooper's Sustainability Advisory Committee. We are really delighted that you could all join us today. I know we're really looking forward to hearing from our expert speakers that we're really fortunate to have with us today. But before we introduce our speakers, I just want to thank the committee members for their incredible hard work on developing recommendations for the city's climate action plan, and especially our subcommittee co-chairs who have been spending a lot of time refining recommendations. I want to just remind everyone that this is very much an ongoing process. We are a standing committee, which hopefully won't always be as time consuming as it has been in the last few months, but we are going to continue advising the mayor indefinitely, and the climate action plan that we're working on will be continually updated. So I hope and certainly intend that what we learned today and moving forward and what we have learned through our prior efforts on environmental justice and climate equity will be fully integrated into our work. And Eric, do you want to add anything before we hand it over to Mary Beth?
Not a lot, Linda. I just want to reiterate the thanks to all of our speakers who have agreed to join us today. We really, really appreciate this and think that this will be an outstanding opportunity for learning and for dialogue, and then also to all the members of the committee, and in particular the subcommittee co-chairs who Linda and I have been working closely with, who really did a lot to help make this event happen, and whose ongoing efforts we truly appreciate. One final comment: we are recording this event so that it can be posted and made available to other people subsequent to this, because we think this will be such an interesting discussion. And then while we do have some curated questions for the panel section of this that will come up later in the agenda, if any individuals on this Zoom throughout the dialogue have additional questions, please post them to the chat, and then we'll monitor that and we can help raise those questions when we get to the appropriate time. Thank you.
Great. All right, well, I'm going to hand it over to Mary Beth Eichard, who is the Transportation and Sustainability Manager for Mayor Cooper. I know, because I heard from several people, how much the mayor wanted to join us today, but we're still delighted to have Mary Beth. She's our hero. She works tirelessly for the city on environmental issues. So Mary Beth, thank you, and over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm really excited to hear from Beverly Wright this morning and talking about environmental justice and how we might reflect on issues of environmental justice and impacts of impending climate change on vulnerable populations in the Nashville area. Linda mentioned that our process for putting together a climate action plan is ongoing. And so this will be a living process and a living document, so that as committee recommendations receive resources and policy and political attention and move their way out into the community, we expect a lot of robust community engagement, and particularly a conversation around how addressing climate change and addressing environmental sustainability can have co-benefits for people in our community who really need to share in those co-benefits. So, for example, a lot of recommendations around energy efficiency and building retrofits, or expanding our public transportation system could have a strong jobs component that could provide people access to a career trajectory and a living wage to bring people into the middle class. So the mayor, you may have seen last week, signed on to a national letter that was put together by the Climate Mayors. The Climate Mayors is an organization that it's a little over 400 mayors that have basically said they're quote unquote still in with regard to the Paris Climate Agreement, and trying to adhere to targets for global warming that within a 10 to 12 year time frame are essentially what we need to do to reduce emissions to prevent catastrophic warming. And what the letter called for was, in the event that the Congress produces a next wave of recovery with the pandemic, that we include a focus on sustainability in those investments, and that we target investments in programs that have already been proven to demonstrate not only benefits for the environment, but benefits for economic shared prosperity and equity. So I encourage you to take a look at the letter, and we put out a local press release on that. I made sure to share that with the committee. But that's the type of thing that we're talking about when we are looking at producing our climate action plan, is weaving a narrative about co-benefits of environmental sustainability into that document so that the public can understand this isn't just for the environment's sake. This is a triple bottom line approach with benefits for the economy and for people. Some examples at the local level that we might consider exploring with regard to just our history here in Nashville. There is an environmental justice section of Nashville Next. If you haven't looked at that, I encourage you to check it out, but it maps areas of our county where we've had people living amongst industrial uses that could have had pollution, and famously we've had a landfill in the Bordeaux area that was open for multiple decades, and there's still a construction and demolition landfill in that area that is in need of expansion with our growth. So we could think about, for example, on our solid waste committee, you know, what we need to do to make sure that a reduce, reuse, recycle framework for our ongoing economic consumption doesn't repeat those same mistakes. Other things that we might consider, I mentioned the energy efficiency and jobs component, but for example, I know Mayor is very interested in North Nashville and negative impacts of the Eisenhower Interstate Highway program, with bifurcating that community and restitching that for economic activity, social cohesion, and reduction of air pollution. We have a history around red line zoning, just like many other American cities, that is having an impact on our conversations around real estate market trends and gentrification and displacement. We have a good inventory of communities where that is a concern in a report produced last term called the Housing Nashville Report, if you want to check that out. And then we have a lot of health disparities, communities that are disproportionately impacted by obesity, hypertension, asthma, and COPD, that, again, when we're talking about access to an expanded urban forest, parks, and green space, giving those folks an opportunity to recreate and to breathe a little easier, particularly as we are in a pandemic that has a respiratory component to it. And then finally, on our adaptation side, we have folks that famously in Hurricane Katrina, you know, are going to be potentially more vulnerable to future events such as tornadoes, flooding, and extreme precipitation, and extreme heat. And so making sure that those communities are appropriately weathered against those risks, that is the focus of this committee. So those are just some themes to think about as we move into the writing and production of the final document. And for sake of time and leaving time for Beverly's remarks and question and answer, I will, I guess, turn it over to our speaker.
I'm going to introduce her.
Yeah, okay, great.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. And just a reminder to everyone to mute your microphones if you're not talking. That would be great. So I'm really excited to introduce Dr. Wright. I have known of her leadership on environmental justice for many years, and sorry, this will date us a little bit, but back to the early 1990s when President Clinton issued an executive order on environmental justice. Dr. Wright is the founder and executive director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. The center addresses environmental and health inequities along the Louisiana-Mississippi River Chemical Corridor and Gulf Coast region. Dr. Wright has conducted groundbreaking research in the area of environmental justice. She has received numerous national awards, including the 2008 EPA Environmental Justice Achievement Award, the prestigious 2009 Heinz Award, as well as the 2010 Beta Kappa Chi Humanitarian Assistance Award bestowed by the National Institute of Science. She co-authored Race, Place, and the Environment after Hurricane Katrina, that was published by Westview Press, and she's also co-authored The Wrong Complexion for Protection, How the Government Response Endangers African American Communities. And that was published by New York University Press. She received her BA from Grambling College and an MA and PhD from State University of New York at Buffalo. Dr. Wright, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Linda, and good morning to everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation, and Ms. Mary Williams, who works with me, my colleague, will assist me in that, so I don't mess it up. Okay, so good morning again. The topic that I'm going to share with you today is one that could be a very long conversation, mainly because I've been doing it for a very long time, but because I've learned so much over these last 30 years or so that I've been doing this work. So to start off, I'd like to tell you a little bit about where I live, and so that it will help you see how I got into this work and how it may apply to you. So I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, along what's called the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor. It's an 85-mile stretch of land between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, for those of you who know anything about this area. And it's lined by 156 petrochemical plants. I need to update my slide. This is the first time I've had to update this particular line on my slide in about 20 years, but we had Governor Jindal, our first, I call him our first brown person of color governor, and he worked very hard to make certain that we became even more polluted than what we were before he took office. And so now we're lined with 156 petrochemical plants and 7 oil refineries that produces approximately 1/4 of the nation's petrochemicals. This is an aerial view, so you can see just how densely populated it is. But what most people don't realize is that people actually live here. So these statistics show you where we were before Katrina and Rita, and then after. And these are the little small towns and cities along the corridor where people actually live, really squeezed in. And this is the slide that I always like to stop on, because this is a list of all of the chemicals that are produced by these facilities where people live. They're extremely dangerous chemicals, and people are actually fence-lined to these. So the beginning of the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor was in the 1940s. And then through 1970, the industry experienced what we call a period of unchecked industrial development. And it was mostly moved forward because of what was happening in the Northeast with the Ohio River on fire, New Jersey really beginning to fight back or push back on the pollution that was being released by industry. They were invited to Louisiana, and to their surprise, they had fewer regulations than what they had in New Jersey. And so they just had a really great time polluting. And then the National Environmental Policy Act was passed in 1969, as most of you may know, because of what happened in Bhopal, where all of the people were killed. So in 1970, President Nixon, I rarely have anything nice to say about him, but he served notice to the American corporations. And this is a quote: "The time has come when we can wait no longer to repair the damage already done." And the EPA was authorized under Nixon. A lot of people don't know that. Also in 1970, the Clean Air Act was passed. And in 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed. But it's really more like 56 years later. It's hard to think of a place where the mission of environmental protection has failed more miserably than in Louisiana's Cancer Alley. National environmental laws that were established were really established a process-based regulatory system. And this is something that's pretty hard for people to understand. When they think of the Environmental Protection Agency, they think about an agency designed to protect the people. It's really designed to regulate poisons. And the standards that they use are industrial standards. They're not health standards, because if they were, Cancer Alley would not exist. And so that's a point that we have to drive home constantly with the communities that we work with and talk to them about what really needs to be changed. So these environmental laws did not ban pollution. They didn't set binding limits on discharge. So consequently, Cancer Alley continued to grow and flourish unchecked by an inadequate regulatory structure, which still exists, by the way. And so industrial professionals and leaders called the Mississippi Chemical Corridor just that, the chemical corridor, responsible for turning small rural towns into urban communities of brick homes and shopping centers, in other words, prosperity. And growing up in that area, I remember clearly when my family would take a drive on Sunday to visit one of my aunties in Baton Rouge. On the way back, the smell was just awful. And as kids, you know, we really cut up. We would just go on about the awful smell and point to one another and said, "You pass gas," or something, the way kids play. And my dad would always say, "Smells like money." And so in other words, it was seen as prosperity. It was many years later that we found out it wasn't just that. And so the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor by locals is called Cancer Alley. And most of us see ourselves as a vast human experiment, blaming the millions of pounds of toxic chemicals for miscarriages, cancer, respiratory ailments, and other serious diseases. Louisiana has the highest cancer rate in the nation. Of the top 10 cancers, we're number 1 and 7 out of 10. The whites in Louisiana have a cancer rate that's 30% higher than the national average, and African Americans in Louisiana have a 30% higher cancer rate than whites, which tells you just how sick we are and continue to be. So I'm sorry, I have to move. All of your faces are on top of my slide. So I have to do something to make you smaller. Okay, there we go. So industry leaders, did I go backwards? I did, sorry. Right. So people living closest to these chemical plants in Cancer Alley wondered if their health was being compromised by the chemical emissions, but had no way of determining what was being released or how much. But this is a typical bad air night in the corridor. This is a typical bad air day in the corridor. It's hard to tell the difference because the air is so thick with chemicals. We're known for industrial accidents and releases. This is a commonplace thing in the corridor. And the thing that's so amazing about all of this is that I believe it was made possible because of disproportionate enforcement by race of the siting of facilities, permitting and licensing of these facilities. By putting them in African American communities, it was a way to get around new environmental regulations. And I needn't give you all of the details of why that was possible, but Louisiana's legacy of racial discrimination is what actually caused the corridor to be able to flourish in the way that it did. So Louisiana's social structure and history undergird the practice of discrimination, leading to disproportionate exposure to toxins and community poisoning with no redress. The disenfranchisement of mostly African Americans and poor whites created an unequal pattern of toxic facility siting, reflecting the harsh realities of racism and classism endemic to the South, which I heard mentioned in the introduction in the very beginning about why we live with some of the things we live with. I keep going backwards, sorry. Okay, I'm gonna bring your faces back because it's really hard to do this when you don't see anyone. So I'm gonna try to, okay, it's really difficult talking to a screen. I didn't realize that, but it's much better to see some of your faces. So the total abdication of responsibility for environmental protection by a social structure that favored the oil and gas industry produced numerous environmental justice communities. I'm going to try to move a little faster now because I'm really taking too long. And now I'm not moving. I did something with the pictures and now it looks like okay, let's see if I can move now. I couldn't. I don't know why I couldn't move. They're not moving. What did I do? Okay. All right, let me go back first. Yeah. And so this is a common scene in Louisiana where communities used to be here and their graveyards were right behind. The industries have actually moved in so close that the only thing left are the graveyards. And of course, it's an area that's designed only for the persons who are not living. Living people certainly couldn't live this close to facilities, but this is what we're left with all over. And so the fight for equal protection began in earnest with new environmental laws did not protect minority and poor communities, and people of color organized to fight for equal protection. And I wanted to take you very quickly through what we call the early struggle, because Louisiana was not the only place that had a cancer alley or some other place that basically has that kind of name related to dying from poison. When I began working, I found out that people all over the country were fighting, and we began aligning ourselves with people in other states, in California, in Texas, and Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and even more. One of our big fights was, in fact, in Tennessee, but I don't have you listed here, sorry. But I wanted to give you just an idea of what people were living with. This is a community that we worked with in Norco, Louisiana. We were eventually able to get them relocated, but this is Marge's front lawn, and you see Shell, the pipelines right in front of her house. It was a terrible place to live, to have to smell it every day, headaches, waking up, throwing up, nosebleeds. It just never ended. And this is what always happens. This is the same community. The company generally gives us a park to play in, which most days kids could not play because the chemicals were so thick, but you can see what children have been living with in the Mississippi River Chemical Corridor. And I found this scene repeated across the United States, where what they got in return was a park where most people couldn't play. But the environmental justice movement began in earnest in Warren County, North Carolina, where this very poor African-American community was fighting a PCB contaminated soil. That was a landfill was being put directly in their communities for PCB contaminated soil. And at that time, we demonstrated against them. These are kids from the community actually lying in the street to stop the trucks. But what we said was that this was dangerous, that this landfill would leak or leach. And in fact, it absolutely did. 10 years later, they had to go in to clean up the landfill. And what followed was a number of things after that case. The General Accounting Office actually produced a report. It basically said the same thing, that there was racial discrimination in citing. That was followed by another report, Toxic Waste and Race, which basically told us what our eyes could see once again, that most landfills hazardous waste landfills were in minority communities. And then the book by Dr. Bullet, Dumping in Dixie, hit the scenes. And at that time, everybody was talking about environmental justice, not understanding it, but at least talking about it at this point. And then we had the first People of Color Summit in Washington, D.C., where we say we took it to the hill in our fight for environmental justice. That was in 1991. And then in 1991, we got our first really large response from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease, where they held a conference dealing with health. That was followed by an EPA equity report, the first time EPA ever dealt with environmental pollution and race and health as it related to communities. That was and that was followed by what I would call the first national response or a federal agency response to everything that we were fighting as it related to EJ. So the National Institute of Environmental Health Science held their first conference. We met for a year and a half every week on conference calls. I think it was every Wednesday, to organize this particular conference. Initially, they wanted only researchers and scientists at the meeting. We fought against that, and we were able to get community, grassroots participation. That conference ended up having about 1,000 people in attendance. And it was during a blizzard in DC. So we were locked in and iced in for all of those days. So even if persons there wanted to run, they couldn't get out of the hotel. So it turned out to be a really great meeting because of the weather. They had to interface with us for all those times. So I wanted to give you just some idea of environmental justice, what it is. It's really people fighting against pollution and for health. And it's moved on to a lot of other things. Now we talk about sustainability and resilience, but that's not where it started. It started just about cleaning up landfills and about moving communities to safety who were fence lined with these highly polluting industries. And then Katrina happened, which also happens to be my hometown. And we got the 500-year storm, as they called it. And I wanted you to see what it looked like when we were anticipating the storm and trying to get out. This is gridlock on Interstate I-10, where you have all of these people in cars. And New Orleans is a relatively small city, but imagine with under 500,000, but with all of these people trying to evacuate at one time, it was impossible. People were on the interstate, they ran out of gas, you name it. It was a complete disaster, even when we put what they call contraflow in place. And then, of course, Katrina hit on August 29th. This is what it looks like. They said it was the size of Alabama. We'd never seen a hurricane as big as that one. And then 10 years later, because we're further out now, I wanted you to see exactly what has happened to us. And then this is just talking about income. And what we find is the income disparities have actually increased rather than decreased. So, and we have very wealthy white people living in New Orleans who moved here from other places. But we basically got an 8% increase in middle and upper class white households. And we had a decline of 4% in Black incomes in the city. And we're feeling it. So the average income of white households in New Orleans is greater than the national average. And the average income of African-American households is lower than the national average. We've actually gotten poorer since the storm, and this is for Black businesses, this is for everything, the takeover of our schools by charter schools, children waiting outside at 5:30 in the morning to be bused across all the way what we call across the river to schools. there's really no school choice. You're just appointed a place with no consideration for where you live and the distance for getting there. We have not had a really good return. And this is what we know. We know that climate change will exacerbate existing inequalities and worsen vulnerabilities of already marginalized populations. This is a shameless plug for 2 books that I think you should read if you're interested in this topic: The Rome Complexion for Protection and Race, Place, and Environmental Justice After Hurricane Katrina, both of which I co-authored with Dr. Robert Bullitt. So climate change will hit poor and people of color in the South hardest. So you can see the GDP going down as much as 6% by the end of the century generally, but in the South, we expect a 20% drop in economic activity. Now, this is without considering COVID-19 and the impacts that it's already having, on our society. What we also know is that disasters widen the racial wealth gap. And I actually lived this. So you see where white communities gain about $126,000 in wealth following receiving their damage money, recovery monies from FEMA, whereas communities of color actually lose up to $29,000. And there's a reason for this. It's so embedded in systemic racism, and it has to do with how your house is valued. So if you're African American, you could have a house twice the size of a white person, but the value of your house is lower just because you live in it. So, but when it comes time to rebuilding that house, the costs are the same. The costs are the same for a house the size of mine versus a white person's house the same size. But the remedies for persons whose houses were damaged during FEMA were based on a formula. That formula was, they looked at 2 numbers: the cost or value of your house or the cost to rebuild your house. And so for us, the cost to rebuild was more than the value of our houses, whereas for white people, the cost to rebuild was less than the value of their house, but they still got the cost to rebuild their houses. So when you look at a number like this and figure out how could that be $126,000? Well, most of us lost our houses and were not able to rebuild. So you're looking at transitional wealth from my parents, any house that I inherited, all in white neighborhoods, not being able to get enough to rebuild it and losing wealth rather than gaining, whereas the opposite was true for whites. So when people look at this, they get kind of puzzled. How could that happen? Well, it's really based on a whole lot of institutionalized racism and systems that are put in place that actually perpetuate the continuation of our not getting our just due. Disaster buyouts and resilience investments benefit whites. So the same thing is happening, and you can see that most of FEMA buyouts were in neighborhoods that were about 80%, 85% or more white, even though whites make up about 62% of the US population. So if this is based on some benefit cost analysis, then the people who end up at the top always are the more affluent neighborhoods, because the benefit cost analysis places them in that position, and we are not valued. There's no benefit in rebuilding a ghetto, if you understand what I'm saying. So we end up losing out again. And then managed retreat leaves the most vulnerable behind. Again, local governments and counties with higher, it should be white populations and higher incomes, are more likely to administer buyouts. So you end up buying out from people who have the most money rather than the people who really need it. And very quickly now I want to introduce you to what we consider to be one of the responses to systemic racism and trying to help communities, our environmental justice communities, who are also impacted by climate change. So we have what's called the HBCU CBO Gulf Coast Equity Consortium, of which Dr. Wingfield is a part. And our center's motto, it's a motto that I sort of developed along with other people, but actually implemented it and refined it, called the Communiversity Motto in Action is what I'm calling this particular presentation. These pictures at the bottom are just pictures of communities that we've worked with and then things that happened after Katrina. But these are the communities that we work with. We work in 5 states. We work in Africatown in Mobile, Alabama, with a community-based organization called Clean, Healthy Economics, Educated, Safe, and Climate Sustainable organization. It's a very long title. I never can remember it. We call it CHESS. We work in the Lower Ninth Ward with Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development. I don't know why our community-based organizations always have these really long names, because they're trying to include all of the things that they work on. And so it's hard for me to remember them. But in Houston, Texas, we work with the Pleasantville community, and they all have their own problems. In the Wedgwood community in Pensacola, and I saw that you're dealing with landfills. They have 13 landfills and counting in this particular community, where borough pits then turn into landfills. And then we also working in Gulfport, Mississippi, with the Turkey Creek community. So the Communiversity model, it's a simplistic idea, but hard to implement. And we just really try to match our communities with university professors who have the expertise or are interested in working on problems that exist in the community. But what's different about this is that we bring people together in what we call the non-threatening environment, and we value the work of our professors as well as our communities. And this shows itself through the dollars that we disseminate. So community people are also paid for their work, as are our professors, when in fact they are paid. So it's a model that sort of puts us all at the same table, and we're all treated as equals. And I often like to tell people that when I first began this work, I was teaching at the University of New Orleans. I had my time to go in my cubby to do my research, to write articles, and to write grants. The whole time I was at the university, I did not get one grant funded. When I began talking to community people, working directly with them and asking them, what is the problem? What should be done? And how do you think we should do it? And I would go back and write the grant to EPA or NIEHS. I got 16 grants funded in the first year of the center. I got none when I was working as a professor in my cubby, not talking to anybody, but just reading from books. So there is value in working directly with communities. What I find is that their responses just make sense. And evidently people reading my proposals felt, this makes sense. So you should talk with the communities. But this is our consortium as it's made up. So we have Dr. Joan Wesley, who works in Mississippi. She's at Jackson State. Dr. Elisha Moss in Alabama, from Alabama A&M, working with Africatown. We have Dr. Glenn Johnson from Texas Southern, working with Bridget in Pleasantville. We have Dr. Bernard Singleton from Dillard University, working with Arthur Johnson. And we have Dr. Warford and Dr. Gregg from Florida A&M, working with Reverend Calvin Avant in Pensacola. Our project is run by, we're the co-directors, myself and Dr. Bullock, and the people that this could not work without are our program managers, Monique Harden, who is Esquire, should be, she's an environmental lawyer, and Dr. Janae King from Texas Southern University. And we have been working with a Kellogg grant, a 4-year grant from Kellogg, that we've now got money from JPB and Kresge Foundation to keep the work that we're doing going. But I want to tell you how we work. So we began, first of all, with making certain that each CBO had enough money to hire a person to assist them in all of the outreach work and calling the meetings together. And they were tasked with organizing their own community and setting up a meeting for us to introduce the project. Through our introduction, we also asked them to define the issues in their communities, what they thought the impacts were, and what they'd like the changes to be. What you're looking at is what came out of those meetings. We had at each meeting over 100 individuals in attendance. That's how concerned these community members are about all of the issues. Many of them flooding, of course. We found that to be a consistent pattern, and air pollution being one of the other. That were issues that were cross-cutting for all of the communities. That was a process that took place over about a 4-month period of organizing, getting information out, collecting data, wanting to know who would be involved. And the project has a number of pieces to it where you have community outreach persons. It is a committee of about 5 or 6 people. It's not just one, and they're volunteer. You have your citizen science group. These are people who are interested in doing research, collecting data. So it is a project with a lot of moving parts. And because we're in 5 different states, 5 different places, I'll say, I won't even say states, but 5 different places, it is very work intensive. And we have expanded since we first began, adding other communities in each of the states to the work that we're doing. I'd be happy to share more information with you about it at another time. But these were the things that were identified. You know, racially discriminatory land use and zoning and air permitting, allowing new construction, just a violation of all the rules. And then the health threats, you can see there were physical threats like asthma, respiratory ailments, diabetes, heart attacks, high blood pressure, and so on. The mental stress was really amazing, especially in all of the communities, but in the Pensacola community where they had 13 landfills where they just keep coming. And so people's backyards are now 100 people's backyards back up to a ditch that goes down 100 feet. People have had to move because of subsidence. It's really a terrible situation that they're living with. And then now we have the relationship between COVID-19 and air pollution. And 79% of African Americans live in areas where the air is polluted. So when you see the numbers of us really dying from this particular disease, people like to say it's because we're sick, because we have diabetes and respiratory ailments, which so do everybody. You know, whether you're white or black, you find these ailments. But what we have is, in addition to that, we have an unbelievable amount of polluted neighborhoods that we live in that cuts across income. It's not just low income, it's middle, it's upper, it's wealthy Black people who live in Black neighborhoods. And then of the 10 dirtiest and lowest paid jobs, African Americans are number 1 in 9 of those 10 jobs. It means we're also exposed more. And we make up a large number of the essential workers, which means we're taking it back home with us as well. Flood risk was another. And so I'm just going to go to the bottom. So with the siting and permitting of polluting facilities, Black communities become sicker and poorer. And with each major disaster and flood event, Black communities become sicker and poorer, if I can repeat what I just said. This slide was, yeah. So another thing that we do that Dr. Wingfield is a part of, and I think I spotted him in the picture on the left. I don't see you now. Yes, I do. Dr. Wingfield is a part of our HBCU Climate Change Conference. It is made up of a consortium of about 32 HBCUs, where each year we come together, where students present their research findings. They get to hear from the top experts in the country on climate. We partner with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they always send us their best scientists. It has grown from 8 universities now to 32. At our last conference, we had over 300 people in attendance. This was not the last one, because I can see it's at Dillard. We also took a large contingency of HBCU students and faculty to the COP, where in 2016, that's when Obama first became president. And I have to tell you, when we showed up, people were looking at us in awe. And one guy said, "Where have you been? Where have you been?" with a French accent. And he basically told us we never see African Americans at the COP conferences. They were so happy to see us there. And boy, were our students happy to get a trip to Paris. It was quite amazing for some of our students who had never been out of Alabama or some of the places where they came from. And I want to end with this, the Climate Action Equity Project. It was in the city was writing its climate action plan. And so it really was a partnership between the city of New Orleans, the Greater New Orleans Foundation, and the Deep South Center. We were Johnny-come-lately to this. We were asked to join towards the end, and we basically challenged the mayor to make certain that this action plan was equitable. And so with that, our former mayor, Landrieu, agreed, and as he left office, our Mayor LaToya Cantrell saw the value of it, and so it was continued. But we started by saying you have to have participations of citizens to know what the problems are. So we asked that we have representatives, community representatives from each council-managed district. So we ended up having a group of people at the table who represented the city. I have to tell you, at the first meeting, it was pretty astounding to see Black people sitting on one side of the table and whites on the other, representing these different districts. That's how clearly white and Black the city has become. And the first question was, how many of you feel that you feel good about your neighborhood and that the recovery is moving smoothly? All of the white people raised their hands. None of the Black people did. And when they said, how many of you are not happy with the recovery and don't feel good about your neighborhoods, all the Black people raised their hands. It gives you an idea of the struggles that we're having. We have 2 New Orleans now, one white and mostly wealthy, and the other poor and getting poorer. And so it was quite a task to finally have these deep discussions about how we could make a climate action plan that was equitable. And we came out with a number of suggestions and a number of areas that I heard, and forgive me, I don't remember her name, the person representing the mayor spoke of, like transportation and energy. All of these things are extremely important, and the way that they will be handled can determine the fate of your most vulnerable populations. And so, how do you get to community-led solutions? On the left, this is a Surviving Cancer Alley. It was a case study that we did of some of the communities that we worked with early and how we were able to come to a good result. The narco case was 15 years. It took us 15 years to get one community relocated, with thousands of people showing up to help us, from lawyers to public health people to all of your scientists, epidemiologists, toxicologists, a whole lot of work. But out of that, we came up with what we call getting to community-led solutions. And I would say employ our model or someone else's model that looks something like the one that we have put in place, because we have a track record. Commit to long-term collaboration with communities in the development and implementation of a research to action agenda. Fund communities in order to staff their work, planning, equip their strategies, expand their knowledge of health, environmental and climate science and policies that impact them. We actually have one community that won its case because we taught them how to use what we call the bucket brigade, came in and showed them how to collect samples. So Shell had been lying about what was in the air, and we were able to catch them in a lie. And that then, once the lie was found out, EPA moved in very quickly, and they changed their minds about relocation. So citizen science is very important, teaching communities how to monitor their own air, to be able to challenge the departments of environmental quality. I call them departments of environmental inequality. At least that's what ours has been in Louisiana. Where was I? Build their capacities on community organizing, effective media communications, engaging policymakers, air monitoring, flood hazard mitigation, et cetera, and assist communities to evaluate activities they have planned or undertaken to achieve their goals and objectives. And what you're looking at is basically what we do in our HBCU CBO Gulf Equity Project. And lastly, one more. So yes, we would like to commend the city of Nashville in its efforts to achieve climate equity and offer support. And these are the things that we can assist you with. Call on us at any time to do so. And I'd like to thank you again. This is a slide they always put together at the end so you know who I am. And this is my contact information, and thank you very much.
Wow, Dr. Wright, thank you so much. Thank you for the offer of help, and that was incredibly informative and also appropriately disturbing. So thank you for sharing all that. The work you're doing is really impressive and inspiring. Let me pause for a minute and remind people to send in questions via the chat function. You can send them to the whole group, or you can just send them to me or Eric. If there are no pressing questions right now, I think we'll go ahead and move to our panel, and we'll have time for questions before we wrap up. So we'd like to now involve some of our local experts in this dialogue with Dr. Wright. Two of them are members of the committee already, and we're really grateful for their involvement. First, I want to introduce Jason Carney. He is the president of Tennessee Solar Energy Association and an energy consultant through his own clean energy consulting business, Energy Electives, LLC. Mr. Carney has conducted advocacy work at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy and served as a consultant for the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. He holds a master's degree focused in civic leadership from Lipscomb University and a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Tennessee State University. Our second speaker is Tori Griffin, who recently moved to Nashville. And Tori, you don't know this, but I was so excited when I saw the announcement that you had joined the Equity Alliance and that you'd worked on environmental justice, that I circulated your bio around the committee quite a bit already. And as you probably already knew, Nashville's environmental community is fairly small, so we are just delighted that you're here and look forward to working with you. Mr. Griffin manages the Equity Alliance's organizing staff and volunteers and oversees civic engagement strategy programs and organizing campaigns. He served as the operations director for Black PAC in 2018 and ran field operations for the Tennessee Black Voter Project. He most recently worked in Atlanta as a regional field organizer for the national NAACP's Environmental Justice Climate Change Program, focusing on environmental and energy issues in the South. He was a political science major at Morehouse College, and during that time was a White House intern under Bill Clinton. So we have to compare notes. I was there at the same time. Tori has experience working on taxation reform, marijuana legalization, labor, faith-based, and political organizing. He has worked on the presidential and congressional campaigns of Al Gore, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John Ossoff for Congress. In 2018, Tori became a first-time candidate running for an at-large county commission seat in Knox County, Tennessee. And then last, alphabetically, but definitely not least, is Dr. Robert Wingfield. He is an associate professor of chemistry at Fisk University. He's the director of the Fisk Community Environmental Toxics Awareness and Sustainability Program, which is funded by NIEHS through the Midwest Consortium. He also has had over 12 years industrial experience in chemical process and product development. He is currently serving as chair-elect of the Nashville section of the American Chemical Society and serves on the executive committee of the Middle Tennessee group of the Tennessee chapter of the Sierra Club. He previously served as external process leader and co-chair of a statewide steering committee to develop an environmental justice strategic plan for the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation. He also previously chaired the Nashville Health Disparities Coalition, and in 2003 was appointed by the mayor of Nashville to the Healthy Nashville 2010 Leadership Council. He has served as an appointed member of the Metropolitan Nashville-Davidson County Wastewater Hearing Authority since 1999, and since April 2006 has served as co-host on the FSK 88.1 FM Health Watch Pathway to Better Health weekly radio show. So we're incredibly fortunate to have you all here. I'm going to try to moderate this discussion just because Zoom can be awkward, but this is really your discussion. So panelists, jump in whenever you have points you want to make. And, you know, before we turn to the proposed discussion questions we developed, I did want to give each of the panelists a chance to just make any opening remarks they want to make or respond to anything that Dr. Wright discussed. So Dr. Wingfield, would you like to start us off? We'll go reverse alphabetical this time.
Okay, and about how much time do I have?
Well, you know, we were thinking that this part would be a little bit more of an unstructured dialogue, kind of working through those questions. So, you know, if you just had, this is your discussion, so whatever you want to do, but I guess we had thought about, you know, make a few minutes, you know, of opening thoughts, and then, you know, we would go to Tori and Jason and then jump into the questions, but very open to however you want to do it.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this opportunity. And first, I want to thank Dr. Wright for being with us here today. She's indeed a very good friend and a clear authority on this area, and we're just really blessed to have her as a part of this discussion. I just want to mention a few things that in terms of this idea that the importance of educating the community regarding some of the climate impacts is very important. Today, we have to address preparing to live in a global pandemic while dealing with an increasing frequency of natural disasters such as tornadoes, high wind events, floods, and wildfires resulting from climate change. The health impacts of climate change are significant. And according to the 2018 National Climate Assessment, and I quote, "Future climate change is expected to further disrupt many areas of life, exacerbating existing challenges for prosperity posed by aging and deteriorating infrastructure, stressed ecosystems, and economic inequalities. Impacts within and across regions will not be distributed equally. People who are already vulnerable, including lower income and other marginalized communities, have lower capacity to prepare for and cope with extreme weather and climate-related events, and are expected to experience greater impacts," unquote. Now, in the last few months, we've seen a disproportionate number of the more vulnerable populations fall ill to COVID-2019. These populations include persons with limited primary health care, pre-existing health conditions, prior significant exposure to air pollutants, the elderly, persons of color, low-income persons, persons living in crowded homes, persons using crowded transportation, essential workers, persons living or working in confined, crowded environments, such as nursing homes, correctional institutions, and food processing plants, as well as the homeless. Nationally, we've seen, and both locally and nationally, significant disparities in the hospitalization and mortality among patients of color versus white patients. And that July 6 New York Times article, which really focused on some of these disparities, laid it out very clearly. And it showed that Latinx and African American residents of the United States have been 3 times as likely to become infected as their white neighbors. According to the new data, which provides detailed characteristics of 640 infections detected in nearly 1,000 US counties. Now, as Black and Latino people have been nearly twice as likely to die from the virus as well as white people. So the reality is that, you know, we here in Nashville and Tennessee are no different than the rest of the world and the United States. So just a little Tennessee data that in terms of Blacks representing 17.1% of the population, they represented 25.7% of the positive cases and 35.7% of the deaths. Hispanic Latino, 6.3% of the population, 32.9% of positive cases, and 9.1% of the deaths. Now, what we need to do is pull back the covers and look upstream. And when we do, we can clearly identify serious inequity issues that exist in the Metro Nashville area. We can see significant disparities in housing, employment, income, access to healthcare, education, and criminal justice. It is clear that Nashville is not the it city for all residents. Affordable housing is a serious issue as we systematically in Nashville displace the low-income residents from the central city and force them out to the suburbs and even other counties. This puts them at a greater economic burden. They will have to spend more for housing, commute further for the needed health services, education, and jobs. Our public education system in Nashville is not equitable. Your neighborhood and economic resources can determine the quality of the education that you receive. Nearly 1/6, that's actually 15.4% in 2018 of Metro Nashville live in poverty and do not have adequate resources for food and housing. High housing cost burden and food insecurity is an issue. And this is important, that people who live in poverty endure chronic stress, which impacts their physical and mental health. What we're striving to achieve here is a strong measure of resilience for all segments of the Nashville population. Resiliency is a key factor since the groups identified above may have fewer resources to prepare for a disaster or pandemic. A limited ability to evacuate, a shelter in place, or in-home lockdown or quarantine, or the limited capability or resources to bounce back economically and health-wise. It is important that we constantly move toward achieving health equity for all, regardless of race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. We must work to address the needs of all segments of the population in Nashville as we develop our climate sustainability plan. Public participation in decision-making is always of concern. Typically in Nashville, public input is often been denied and limited from the most vulnerable. There's a significant question of how will stakeholders from vulnerable populations be included in the decision-making process. Secondly, we have to educate all community residents as to how they can prepare and effectively manage living with climate change and a global pandemic manifested as COVID-19. Important is knowing the risks that they face and knowing the key steps to prepare for and manage within that risk. Also preparing them to be able to successfully survive things we encounter here frequently, such as tornadoes, floods, and high wind events, and preparing them to effectively live within a pandemic. Now, we also have to address community preparedness, and that essentially breaks down to neighbor helping neighbor. And we've been very fortunate in that sense that the recent tornado, et cetera, there was a lot of neighbor helping neighbor. Some residents actually, might need additional help. They have some special needs, disabled, senior. And as a community, we have to make sure in our planning that that is addressed. It's important to maintain your mental health during a pandemic or climate change events. Mental health should be an important part of the disaster community recovery plan. We must educate all ages as to how they can live and practice sustainably. We should provide incentives for the lifestyle. Items include such as practicing energy and water use reduction, more use of efficient energy appliances, home weatherization, etc. We must push toward the reducing greenhouse gas emissions by using mass transit, carpooling, walking, etc. for all segments of the population. And this is important in Nashville. Sidewalks are a critical issue. We need adequate sidewalks in many neighborhoods, both for safety reasons and reduction in vehicle use. We must facilitate the use of solar energy, local community centers, businesses, churches, schools, etc., in low-income neighborhoods. And we have to educate members of minority community in skills needed for installation of solar energy. We must continually guard the quality of our outdoor air and work to ensure quality indoor air for residents in low-income communities. We must put policies, plans, and finances in place to make sure that all residents, regardless of socioeconomic status, have equitable access to health care. The health impacts of climate change are well documented. We want to make sure that all residents of Nashville have the health care they need to remain healthy. We must, in Nashville, strengthen and expand the safety net. Metro Nashville should provide relocation assistance to families living in flood-prone areas. After the 2010 flood, we made some significant strides in that area. We have to move forward and have policies and plans in place to continue that. We must provide grants for the repairing of homes in low-income areas damaged by tornadoes and high wind events. We should make sure that storm shelters are located where they can be conveniently reached by residents of the low-income communities. So in summary then, we've got to make sure that we include the voices of all residents of our communities. We want everybody at the table having a voice. We've got to set up public meetings so that notices get out to all segments of the population. These meetings should be held at times that's accessible by all members of the population. These meetings should be conducted in clear and understandable language so they can follow what we're trying to do. So we must work to be inclusive of all. And as we work nationwide to address a multitude of injustices, we must keep environmental justice and climate equity front and center.
Thank you. Boy, that was packed with information. We obviously have a lot to learn and a lot to discuss, and we had scheduled this, we only have 20 more minutes today. What I'm going to ask of our local panelists, if they, and we'd love to have Dr. Wright, but we don't want to impose on you, but if we could plan to reconvene at our next committee meeting to continue this dialogue, because I want to give everyone, a chance to talk. And so if everyone is okay with this, what I would suggest is that Mr. Griffin offer some observations, and then Mr. Carney, and then perhaps Dr. Wright would want to close us out with a few remarks, and we will schedule a second session, if that's all right with our local folks. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right, great. So can I hand it over to you, Mr. Griffin?
Cool. Dr. Wingfield took my whole presentation. That was it. I mean, that was the whole thing. No, but everything that Dr. Wingfield said is true. To have an adequate climate adaptation plan, you have to reach out to communities that don't get reached. And I think because all of us use the internet, we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have access to web and et cetera, we think everything is going to be you can put a survey on a website and everyone will go to it, not realizing that everyone doesn't have a laptop at home. Everyone doesn't have internet access. And sometimes you have to do the old fashioned, and I tell people this even on campaigns today. I'm 39, but I do remember when you had to call people and knock on a door. You didn't have Twitter, you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have all these tools that we use today, and digital organizing, and that it's okay to pick up a phone and call people and have conversations, and also to be face-to-face. I know the COVID has limited what we can do in a face-to-face, but I know that the kind of the populations that you want to reach out to, they're not going to have access to the mayor's council on Facebook. They're just not. And sometimes you have to be creative. And also the types of people, and this is where I think sometimes we get ahead of ourselves. And I'm cognizant of myself, is the fact that we believe that we're doing right by folks when we have these committees, or we have these whatever you want to call them, and we think we're doing right, and we think, this is equitable, this is equity, and we think this is the right thing, and we haven't asked the people who we're trying to help, what do you want? What do you need? And that doesn't happen in a week. It doesn't happen in a month. It doesn't happen in 6 months. These are long-term conversations, and no, they're not pretty, and no, they're not. I mean, you just had a tornado that hit March, and then tornado hit, then you had COVID, and so people who lived in North Nashville, you got hit with a double whammy. And then in addition to the double whammy, you have realtors and developers coming in and trying to buy that property, because that's normally what happens when an area of predominantly poor Black folks, when their property gets damaged or destroyed, you always have someone ready to come in and buy at the lowest bid. And so we've got to be cognizant of that, making sure that when you do have a plan, that people are made whole. When another population that gets hit, Dr. Wingfield mentioned on it, you have ex-offenders and those that are in prison. When we think about sustainability, when we think about restructuring our communities, they're not thought of because of their criminal records. If they're out, they're part of our community too. When I think of just those populations that we kind of want to ignore, homeless. I haven't talked about what do we do about the homeless, and Nashville has a homeless problem. And so I just think in terms of when we think of a climate adaptation plan and we think of all of this, we've got to think of people who we may not want them to sit at our dinner table at night, but they are part of our community too. And what are their needs, and how do we make them whole, and how do we bring them up? And I'm glad, I can't think of her name too, the first for the mayor's office, and when she talked about jobs to bring people to the middle class. I love the fact that Mr. Carney, I've talked to him before too, about solar in Tennessee. We have no shortage of sun. This is green jobs that brings people into the middle class. These are good jobs. That anyone, regardless of your skill level, can be a part of. And we've got to get people. I love my home state, but the worst part about it is we've got the lowest unemployment in the country, but we also have the lowest wages in the country. No one in this country, and this is my personal belief, should have to work 2 to 3 jobs to make ends meet. That's ridiculous. And so there are opportunities to make sure that folks can work 1 gig and put food on the table and pay bills and have rent and live in the city and be able to comfortably live in the city that they live in. That's the goal. And so one of the things that the Equity Alliance does and does well is that we reach out to communities that don't get talked to, that folks are afraid to talk to. So hopefully when this plan comes together and you're looking for ways to, partner with organizations or to find people that don't get to be at the table, we can be a part of that and making sure that that table looks like the city of Nashville.
Well put. Thank you. Mr. Carney, do you want to make a few remarks?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Beverly Wright for a great presentation. And I think she understands. I heard her say that was important. So somewhat of an inside joke, but wonderful presentation. So glad to meet her. And just kind of for perspective's sake, on a day when one of my real heroes is being finally put to rest in Atlanta, John Lewis, I'm consoled that I get to hold on to the cape of Dr. Wingfield, Dr. Wright, and Dr. Bullard to keep going forward. So glad to have her, glad to get to know Dr. Wingfield. As Tori said, he's already said everything probably that needs to be said. So also thankful to Vanderbilt, Linda and Eric for having this, and the intelligentsia of environmentalism in Nashville for being on the line as well. So I'll just say a couple things. I think in the last 4 years, we're used to stream of consciousness kind of talk. So I'll just do stream of consciousness. It may not follow linearly, but it's my thoughts. So one thing is we have a real energy burden problem in Memphis. That's the highest energy burden in the country. And my zip code is the highest energy burden in Nashville, 37207. And that's something that we've got to go after and attack and address. Poor air quality is something that Dr. Wright talked about, and Dr. Wingfield. And, even before COVID, we spent 90% of our time indoors. So that's probably even higher. And in some of the work that I do, I find that, we don't go into our crawl spaces and we don't see, we're talking about outdoor air, but indoor air is also important, air quality and what we deal with health-wise. And I just did some work for a widow, Black lady, that when it rained, she smelled mildew. And when you got up under the house, ducts were wide open, and it was because all that negative air was coming into her space. She didn't know that. So things like the Rounded Up bill need to be put in place so that we can address these indoor air quality issues like that. And all these things lead to health benefits. We need to do better with that. That's RS 2018-1508 on your listening dial if you wanted to know. We need to pull out of the TVA contract. I'm just going to say it. It's too long. It's 20 years. We need to pull out of that. I know it's heavy lifting. It's hard, but that's the inspiration I get from a Dr. Wright, that they do the hard stuff. They don't listen to it's too hard. They do it. So we need to pull out of that so that we can actually negotiate and do some of these things that need to be done with energy efficiency, solar energy, and we need to create an environmental justice office in the mayor's office. We need someone who keeps up with this stuff, who keeps up with the data, who pushes this, we don't have that. We need the political will, and that's, you know, the end of the story. We have the ability, the technology is there, but we just need to have the political will to get these things done, continue to educate folks. There is a law already on the books called the Equal Business Opportunity Law. That's BL 2018-1419 that needs to be enforced, and it needs to be kept up with. Places like Vanderbilt, again, kudos that you are divesting. I think Vanderbilt needs to challenge its peers to do the same and to bring on folks like Dr. Wright. Shamefully, you know, I'm just a kid from North and West Nashville that is just trying to find his way and follow his heart. And I didn't know Dr. Bullard, and I felt like it was a gold mine. I was like, oh my God. And it was because Vanderbilt brought him here, and I saw that, and I came down, and it's like, this is the godfather or grandfather of the environmental movement. So, and then, you know, now we have Dr. Wright. I now know Dr. Wingfield. We need to continue to bring folks in of this caliber to educate us and to speak, you know, no holds barred and unbiased about, you know, what we're dealing with. We need annual reports to the mayor's office and the city council about where our progress is. We need an energy and an environment reporter at one of the local papers. We got Dave Fleischner down in Chattanooga that covers this stuff. We have nothing like that in Nashville, and none of Tennesseans, Nashville scene, no one has anybody that follows this stuff. So we stay uneducated. And we have, you know, structures in place that we could support. NAACP has an environment and climate justice chapter or section that needs to be considered and promoted, supported, and really just the green economy overall, the Green New Deal, the clean energy economy, whatever you want to call it. We've got to push to promote this, to support this, to make it a part of our Nashville scene. And you know, as I said, again, just follow these, you know, strong voices that care about the environment and care about justice, because they are linked. We can't serve, you know, we can't move past justice when we start looking at sustainability. And one thing, you know, that's kind of recent, not recent, but there was a article about it, was, you know, looking at when we build, when we do infrastructure, you know, who is it hurting? There was just my granddad anecdotally used to always, you know, say, you know, we used to have Tina Turner, and we used to have Jimi Hendrix and Little Richard, all of them down here on Jefferson Street. And it was popping. And then Al Gore's dad put that interstate through here and killed all that. So that was just anecdotal. But now I have a much better understanding that is part of, you know, environmental injustice and the pollution that comes from it, the structural racism that is a part of it. Is something we all need to learn more about. So again, I thank Dr. Wright. I think Dr. Wingfield, and it's good to be on the panel with Mr. Griffin as well. And thank you.
Wow, thank you all so much. You notice I keep setting my phone down and then I have to pick it up to take more notes because I have like this incredible list now of ideas, new ideas. So we have 5 minutes left. So what I was going to propose, Dr. Wright, if you're willing to, you know, share any more wisdom with us about, you know, what we should be focusing on, and then hand it over to Eric just to wrap it up.
So I'm going to be very quick, but I want to acknowledge Dr. David Padgett. I see that he's on with us. You didn't see his name with our HBCU CBO Gulf Equity Project, and that's because he is our floating faculty mentor. He actually works in all of the communities with us and has done just some magnificent work. I would suggest that you certainly lean on Dr. Wingfield and Dr. Paget, two researchers and scholars that are just unbelievable in the work that they do and what they have done. So we have some good people right there in Nashville, Tennessee, who've been working with us in Louisiana for quite a long time. So I'm more than willing to give back. Hey, David, I see you now. I wanted to say, and David is the recipient of our Environmental Justice Award through our conference, our climate change conference. He's been with us from the beginning. But I would say that just in listening to everything that you all plan to embark upon, it's a big plate. And I think that one of the hardest things is trying to figure out, where do you start to make a difference? And I found that you start taking little bites, and so that you can feel like you've accomplished something. And then from then it will begin to grow on its own. And I don't know how to explain it, except that when you start with something, a project, working in a community, and people get excited about it and you make progress, you find you start getting calls from other communities and other people who want to work on it. You have to make some inroad so you don't get so worn down. You need to find something that you know you can really dig into and make a difference. And that will help you then take on things after that. Now you got, I guess 10 or 12 different areas that need attention. But I suspect you have organizations on the ground working with all of these, in all of these areas, from working with homeless people to the gentrification thing is something that's really, really toxic in my city, for example. It's destroying the indigenous population that's responsible for the culture of the city, which is the reason the city is on the map. And so if you destroy your indigenous culture, then you destroy the reason for coming to visit New Orleans. Why come there? If what people are coming for will be gone. And that's what we're watching. I remember Bullard said one time after Katrina, he said, if you all aren't careful, there'll be monuments in front of neighborhoods saying this is where Black people used to live. And we are experiencing that right now, where they're now putting plaques for Louis Armstrong's houses and stuff, where we are being very quickly removed from neighborhoods that are historic, that go all the way back to the free colored era. That's before the Civil War. The old 6th and 7th wards are disappearing. And the people who are moving in don't look like us. They don't act like us. They're just not us. And you see things changing. So the cultural part of your city is just as important as everything else. And you need to try to find a way to make certain, that remains. So Nashville is known. Nashville, Tennessee has a lot of culture. Make sure that you don't lose it. And find a way to work together where you can at the end say, we've been successful at something. Being successful at something. Success brings more success. It also brings more money when you're successful to be more successful. And that's the lesson that I've learned. You can take on way too much, and then at the end you're like, you didn't get anything done except that I'm really tired. Or you can take on something where there's some promise and, you can get moving and it energizes you and it brings other people into the fold. That's the best advice I think I can give you for tackling what we are all tackling in this spirit of awakening to systemic racism. And I think that because I'm a sociologist, I always understood systemic racism as part of what we teach. I was looking at some old quotes and it was so amazing. We were saying race matters. Black Lives Matter is what it is now, but in all of my reports, I would say race matters, showing. So we've been saying this for a very long time. Now it seems like some people are listening And we need to capitalize on that to see if we can move forward. Thank you.
Great advice. Eric?
Well, Dr. Wright, Dr. Wingfield, Jason, Tori, it wasn't just a pleasure to have you all here today, but it was really an honor. And I expressed that on my own personal behalf and on behalf of everybody who's on this call today. I appreciate what everybody said. Dr. Wright, I will tell you, it was not so long ago that I, with my spouse, drove from New Orleans to Baton Rouge, back roads, and didn't know much about the chemical corridor, but certainly witnessed it. And it was very, very educational for me to learn so much more about that today. It was, first of all, very troubling, but also inspirational to know about the really incredible and important work that you're doing. You know, Tori, your point about how do you reach out to the underrepresented parts of the city and create a dialogue that itself is enduring and needs to be long lasting, and just like this dialogue needs to be just incredibly good stuff. And I look forward, like Linda said, to us being able to reconvene and have even more of a discussion. This is such important work, and you know, I'm privileged to be part of a group like this with such wonderful contributors and colleagues.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye.